The shovel hit rock again, and Clara Brennan's bleeding palms screamed in protest as the impact jolted through her arms like lightning through a summer sky. She had been digging for 3 days straight in the unforgiving Arizona Territory soil, her husband Thomas barely cold in the ground just 50 yards from where she now stood waist-deep in this cursed hole. The year was 1882, and the drought had turned their small homestead into a wasteland of cracked earth and dying cattle. Thomas had promised her they would strike water before the month ended, but then the fever took him, leaving Clara with nothing but debts, a failing ranch, and the desperate knowledge that without water she would lose everything they had sacrificed to build. She was 24 years old, a widow with no family, no neighbors close enough to help, and hands that had once been soft now transformed into raw, blistered flesh that wept with every movement. The sun beat down mercilessly on her back as she bent to scoop another shovelful of dirt, her muscles trembling with exhaustion. She had not eaten a proper meal in days, rationing what little food remained in the cabin, every ounce of her strength devoted to this single purpose. Water meant life. Water meant keeping the land Thomas died trying to tame. Clara heard the horse approaching but did not look up. Strangers meant trouble more often than not, and she had learned in her brief time as a frontier wife that showing weakness invited predators of every kind. She kept digging, her jaw set, even as the hoofbeats stopped somewhere above her, and she felt the weight of a gaze upon her bent back. "That is no job for a woman alone," a voice said, deep and rough as weathered leather. "Then it is fortunate I did not ask for your opinion," Clara replied without pausing in her work, though her arms shook so badly she nearly dropped the shovel. She heard boots hit the ground, spurs jingling softly, and then a shadow fell across the hole. Clara finally looked up, squinting against the bright sky, and saw a man standing at the edge of her excavation. He was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek water, a dusty black hat shading a face that might have been handsome if not for the weariness etched into every line. His clothes marked him as a drifter, a cowboy without a home, his saddlebags worn and his gun belt well used. "How deep have you gone?" he asked, studying the hole with a practiced eye. "Deep enough to know I have further still," Clara said, her voice cracking slightly. She swallowed hard against the dryness in her throat. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have work to do." The cowboy was quiet for a long moment, and Clara forced herself to turn away, to bend once more to her impossible task. She heard him walking, assumed he was leaving, and felt a strange mixture of relief and unexpected disappointment. Then she heard something that made her freeze. The sound of a second shovel biting into earth. She spun around to find the cowboy had climbed down into the hole with her, had retrieved her husband's spare shovel from where it leaned against the cabin wall, and was now working alongside her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "What are you doing?" Clara demanded, anger flashing hot in her chest. "I did not ask for your help. I cannot pay you." "Did not ask for payment," the cowboy replied, not stopping his steady rhythm. "Name is James Coulter. Saw your husband in town 2 weeks back, trading for supplies. Heard he passed. Figured you might need a hand." "I do not need charity," Clara said, but her voice lacked conviction and they both knew it. "Not charity," James said, finally pausing to look at her directly. "Just one person helping another. Way things used to be done before everyone got so focused on themselves." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to maintain her pride, but as she looked down at her ruined hands and felt the way her legs trembled beneath her, she found she could not force the words out. Instead, she simply nodded once, a sharp jerk of her chin, and returned to digging. They worked in silence for hours, the sun tracking across the sky as 2 shovels moved in counterpoint, biting deep into the Arizona earth. James worked with the easy competence of a man who had spent his life doing hard labor, his movements efficient and untiring. Clara struggled to match his pace, her pride refusing to let her stop even as her body begged for rest. As afternoon faded toward evening, James finally spoke again. You should take a break, drink some water, eat something. Water is almost gone, Clara admitted, hating how defeated she sounded. Need to save it for the stock. James climbed out of the hole with surprising agility and walked to his horse, a sturdy roan mare with kind eyes. He returned with a canteen and a wrapped bundle that proved to contain dried beef and hardtack. He handed them down to Clara without ceremony. I cannot take your supplies, she protested, even as her stomach clenched with hunger. You can, and you will, James said firmly. No use in you collapsing before we hit water. Then all this digging would be for nothing. The logic was undeniable, and Clara was too tired to argue further. She drank sparingly from the canteen, the water like heaven on her parched throat, and forced herself to eat slowly, even though she wanted to devour everything in sight. James ate his own rations, sitting on the edge of the hole with his legs dangling down, studying the darkening sky. Storm coming, he observed. 2, maybe 3 days out. Clara looked up, saw the distant clouds gathering on the horizon, and felt her heart sink. Rain would help the land, but if we do not have a well by then, it will not matter. The cattle are too weak to last much longer. Then we keep digging, James said simply. Better get some sleep, though. No use killing ourselves. Start again at first light. Clara wanted to protest, wanted to say she would dig through the night if necessary, but exhaustion crashed over her like a wave and she found herself nodding. James helped her out of the hole, his hand warm and calloused against her raw palms, and she had to bite back a gasp of pain at the contact. Inside the cabin, James lit the oil lamp while Clara sank into the single chair at her rough-hewn table. The space was small and spare, everything in it speaking of poverty and struggle. Thomas's coat still hung on its peg by the door, and Clara had not been able to bring herself to move it. James examined her hands in the lamplight, his touch surprisingly gentle as he turned them palm up. The blisters had burst, leaving open wounds crusted with dirt and blood. He made a low sound in his throat, something between sympathy and frustration. You have any clean cloth, whiskey? He asked. Clara directed him to the small supply of bandages she kept, and the bottle of whiskey Thomas had been saving for a special occasion that never came. James cleaned her hands with a thoroughness that spoke of experience tending wounds, his face serious and concentrated. The whiskey burned like fire, and Clara bit her lip hard enough to taste blood, but she did not cry out. You are tougher than most men I have known, James said quietly as he wrapped her palms in clean strips of cloth. But tough does not mean invincible. You need to be more careful. Careful is a luxury I cannot afford, Clara replied, watching his bent head as he worked. His hair was dark brown, nearly black, and curled slightly at the nape of his neck where it brushed his collar. If I do not find water, I lose everything. The bank will take the land, and I will have nothing. Thomas died for this place. I will not let it go without a fight. James finished bandaging her hands and sat back, his green eyes searching her face. Your husband would not want you to kill yourself for a piece of land. My husband is dead, Clara said, the words coming out harsher than she intended. And I am alive, and this land is all I have left of what we tried to build together. I will not abandon it. James nodded slowly, as if he understood something that went beyond her words. Then we find water, he said. Together. That night, James insisted on sleeping in the barn with his horse, refusing Clara's half-hearted offer of the cabin floor. She lay alone in the bed she had shared with Thomas, staring at the rough ceiling beams, and wondered at the strange turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she had been completely alone, convinced she would fail and lose everything. Now there was a stranger sleeping in her barn, a cowboy who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to voice. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of Thomas calling her name from the bottom of a dry well, his voice growing fainter and fainter until she could not hear it at all. Dawn broke clear and already warm, promising another scorching day. Clara woke to find James had already started digging, the sound of his shovel a steady rhythm that drew her from the cabin, still tying her hair back with a frayed ribbon. Her hands throbbed beneath their bandages, but the pain had become almost familiar, something she could push to the back of her mind. "You should have woken me," she said, climbing down into the hole beside him. "Figured you needed the rest," James replied, not breaking his rhythm. "Besides, made good progress. We are getting deeper." They fell into a pattern over the next 2 days, working from dawn until the heat became unbearable in the midday hours, resting in the shade of the cabin, then returning to their labor as the afternoon cooled. They spoke little while digging, saving their breath for the work, but during their rest periods, Clara found herself learning about the quiet cowboy who had so unexpectedly entered her life. James Coulter was 30 years old, born in Texas to a ranch family that had lost everything in the aftermath of the Civil War. He had spent the last dozen years drifting from job to job, working cattle drives and breaking horses, sleeping under the stars more often than under a roof. He had no home, no family left living, nothing but his horse and his skills and a restless need to keep moving. "Why did you stop here?" Clara asked on the afternoon of the second day, as they sat in the cabin sharing a meal of beans and the last of her flour made into flat bread. "You could have kept riding. This is not your problem." James was quiet for a long time, his gaze distant. "I spent a lot of years not caring about anything except the next job, the next town," he finally said. "Gets lonely after a while, gets empty. Saw you out here digging alone, saw those blisters on your hands, and something just told me to stay. Maybe I am tired of drifting. Maybe I wanted to do something that mattered for once." Clara felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the heat outside. She looked at James in the lamplight, really looked at him, and saw not just a drifter but a man who had known loss and loneliness just as she had, who understood what it meant to fight for something when the world seemed determined to take it away. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for staying. For helping. I do not know what I would have done without you." James met her eyes and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. "You would have kept digging," he said. "You would have found a way. You are that kind of woman." That night, the storm James had predicted arrived with a fury that shook the cabin walls. Thunder rolled across the territory like cannon fire, and lightning split the sky in jagged white scars. Clara stood at the window, watching the rain pour down in sheets, blessing the parched earth even as her heart ached with the knowledge that it was not enough. Rain would help, but without a well, without a steady source of water, the ranch was still doomed. A knock at the door made her jump. She opened it to find James standing there, soaked to the skin, his hat dripping water. "Wanted to make sure you were all right," he said over the sound of the storm. "This cabin does not look too sturdy." "It has weathered worse," Clara said, though she was not entirely certain that was true. "Come in, you will catch your death out there." James hesitated, propriety warring with practicality, but another crack of thunder decided him. He stepped inside, and Clara quickly shut the door against the driving rain. She handed him a threadbare towel, the only one she had, and busied herself building up the fire while he dried off as best he could. They sat together by the hearth as the storm raged outside, the firelight dancing across the cabin walls. Clara found herself studying James's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes reflected the flames. He had become familiar to her in these few short days, his presence a comfort she had not expected to feel again after Thomas's death. "Tell me about him," James said suddenly. "Your husband, if you want to." Clara was surprised by the question, but after a moment, she found she did want to talk about Thomas. She told James about how they had met in Missouri, how Thomas had dreamed of building something of his own in the territories, how they had saved every penny for 3 years before finally making the journey west. She talked about the early days on the ranch, the backbreaking work of building the cabin and the barn, the joy of seeing their first calf born. She spoke of Thomas's kindness, his quick laugh, the way he used to sing off-key when he thought no one was listening. "He sounds like a good man," James said when she finished. "He was," Clara agreed, and realized with a start that talking about Thomas no longer brought the sharp stab of pain it once had. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had softened somehow, transformed into something she could carry without being crushed beneath its weight. He deserved more time than he got. Most good people do, James said quietly, but that is the way of the world. We just have to make the most of what we are given. The storm continued through the night, and neither of them wanted to risk the run to the barn. So James slept on the floor by the fire wrapped in an old quilt while Clara lay in her bed, listening to the rain and the sound of his steady breathing. She felt safer than she had in months, knowing she was not alone, and that realization both comforted and frightened her. Morning brought clear skies and renewed determination. The rain had left standing water in every depression, and the air smelled clean and fresh. Clara and James returned to the well, now partially flooded with muddy runoff, and began the laborious process of bailing it out before they could continue digging. They were 18 feet down when James's shovel hit something that gave a hollow thunk. He froze, then carefully scraped away more dirt, revealing a seam of darker rock. "This is good," he said, excitement creeping into his usually controlled voice. "This could be an aquifer marker. We need to go down maybe another 5 feet, break through this layer." Hope flared in Clara's chest, bright and painful. "You think we are close?" "I think we might be," James said, and his grin transformed his face, making him look younger and lighter. "Come on, let us find out." They attacked the rock layer with renewed energy, Clara's pain forgotten in the rush of possibility. The stone was stubborn but not impossible, and slowly, inch by agonizing inch, they broke through. The sun was setting when James's shovel suddenly sank deeper than expected, and a dark stain began to spread across the bottom of the whole water. Clara stared at it for a long moment, unable to quite believe what she was seeing. Then she dropped to her knees in the mud, scooping up a handful of the precious liquid, watching it run through her bandaged fingers. A sound escaped her throat, half laugh and half sob, and then James was kneeling beside her, his arm around her shoulders as she shook with the force of her relief. "We did it," she gasped. "We actually did it." "You did it," James corrected gently. "I just helped finish what you started." Clara turned to look at him, their faces very close in the dimming light, and saw her own emotions reflected in his eyes. Without thinking, acting on pure instinct and overwhelming gratitude and something deeper she was not yet ready to name, she kissed him. James went very still for a heartbeat, and Clara started to pull back, mortified by her own boldness. But then his hand came up to cup her cheek, gentle despite his calluses, and he was kissing her back with a tenderness that made her heart ache. They broke apart slowly, both breathing hard, still kneeling in the mud at the bottom of the well they had dug together. Clara knew she should feel guilty, that it had barely been a month since Thomas died, but all she felt was alive. More alive than she had felt since before the fever took her husband, maybe more alive than she had ever felt. "I am sorry," she whispered. "That was inappropriate." "You must think I am terrible." "I think you are brave and strong and beautiful," James said, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "And I think your husband would want you to keep living, not bury yourself alongside him." Clara closed her eyes, tears leaking from beneath her lids, and let herself lean into James's solid warmth. They stayed like that until full dark, holding each other at the bottom of a well that represented everything Clara had fought for, everything she refused to lose. Over the following weeks, the well transformed the ranch from a dying venture into something with a real chance of survival. James helped Clara build a proper wellhead with a pulley system for drawing water, and together they hauled bucket after bucket to the weakened cattle. The animals recovered slowly but steadily, and Clara watched with profound relief as they regained their strength. James showed no signs of leaving. He threw himself into the work of the ranch as if it were his own, mending fences and patching the barn roof, and breaking a pair of wild horses Clara's husband had caught, but never had time to train. He moved into the barn without discussion, maintaining the appearance of propriety, But Clara found herself making excuses to spend time near him, drawn to his quiet competence and steady presence. They fell into an easy partnership, each anticipating the other's needs without words. James taught Clara things Thomas had never known about ranching, skills learned over years of drifting from spread to spread. Clara cooked hearty meals that put meat back on James's lean frame and mended his worn clothes with careful stitches. The people of the nearby town, a dusty collection of buildings called Cedar Springs some 15 miles distant, began to talk. Clara heard the whispers when she went in for supplies, the speculations about the widow Brennan and her handsome cowboy. She held her head high and ignored them, but the gossip stung nonetheless. "Does it bother you?" she asked James one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "What people are saying about us?" James was quiet for a moment, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a bird, the shavings curling away from his knife. "I have spent most of my life not caring what people think," he finally said. "But I do not want to make things hard for you. If you want me to move on, I will understand." "No," Clara said quickly, more quickly than was probably wise. "I do not want you to leave. I just wanted to know if the talk bothered you." "Only thing that bothers me is that they are talking instead of minding their own business," James said with a slight smile. "But folks always need something to gossip about. Gives them a sense of purpose, I suppose." Clara laughed despite herself. "You have a cynical view of human nature." "Just realistic," James replied. He set aside his whittling and turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Clara, I need to tell you something. I have been here over a month now, and I do not want there to be any misunderstanding between us." Clara's heart began to pound, uncertainty mixing with hope. "What is it?" "I am falling in love with you," James said simply. No flowery words or elaborate declarations, just the plain truth laid out between them. "Have been since that first day when I saw you digging alone with your hands bleeding and your back straight and your jaw set. I know it is too soon. I know you are still mourning your husband, and I do not want to pressure you into anything. But I needed you to know. I am not staying just to help with the ranch. I am staying because I cannot imagine being anywhere else." Clara felt tears prickling her eyes, but they were not sad tears. She reached across the space between them and took James's hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I am falling in love with you too," she admitted, the words both terrifying and liberating. "And I feel guilty about it because Thomas deserves to be mourned, deserves more than being forgotten after only a couple of months. But I also know he would not want me to be alone and miserable. He always said life was too short to waste on anything but living fully." "He was a wise man," James said, squeezing her hand gently. "I need time," Clara continued. "I need to feel like I am doing right by Thomas's memory. But I also need you to know that when I am ready, when enough time has passed that I can move forward without feeling like I am betraying him, I will want to build a life with you, if you are willing to wait." James brought her bandaged hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles softly. "I have been waiting for something worth staying for my entire life," he said. "I can wait a little longer." The seasons turned, summer giving way to the cooler days of autumn. The ranch continued to recover, and with James's help, Clara was able to pay off the bank and even start putting aside a small savings. They worked side by side every day, their partnership deepening into something profound and unshakable. Clara found herself healing in ways she had not expected. The sharp grief for Thomas softened into a bittersweet gratitude for the time they had shared, and she began to feel less like she was betraying his memory, and more like she was honoring it by choosing to live and love again. She visited his grave regularly, talking to him as she had when he was alive, and somehow she thought he would approve of James, would be glad she had found someone to stand beside her. On a crisp October morning, 6 months after James had first picked up a shovel and stayed, Clara woke with a sense of certainty she had not felt in a long time. She dressed carefully in her best dress, a simple blue cotton that brought out her eyes, and walked to the barn where James was feeding the horses. He looked up at her approach, a smile spreading across his face that made her heart skip. "You look pretty this morning," he said. "Special occasion." "I want to go into town today," Clara said. "I want to see the preacher." James went very still, his eyes searching her face. "Clara, I am ready," she said simply. "If you still want me, if you are still willing to stay." James crossed the space between them in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around until she laughed breathlessly. When he set her down, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "I will stay forever if you will have me," he said. "I will spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." "I could never regret it," Clara said, cupping his face in her hands. "You saved me, James, not just the ranch, but me. You reminded me what it felt like to hope." They rode into Cedar Springs together that afternoon, and despite the raised eyebrows and renewed gossip, Clara felt nothing but joy. The preacher, a kindly old man named Reverend Walsh, agreed to marry them the following Sunday, giving them time to post the banns and make the union official in the eyes of both God and the law. The wedding was small, attended by a handful of neighbors who had warmed to the couple over the months and genuinely wished them well. Clara wore her blue dress with wildflowers in her hair, and James had managed to find a clean white shirt and a string tie. They spoke their vows in the little church with sunlight streaming through the windows, promising to love and honor each other for as long as they both lived. When the preacher declared them married and told James he could kiss his bride, the cowboy did so with a reverence and passion that left no doubt about the depth of his feelings. Clara kissed him back just as ardently, and the small congregation erupted in applause and cheers. The ranch truly became theirs after that, not just Clara's but James's as well. They worked together to expand it, carefully investing their profits into more cattle and better equipment. James proved to have a keen head for business to go along with his ranching skills, and Clara's determination combined with his experience made them a formidable team. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. A harsh winter tested both the stock and their supplies, and they spent many long, cold nights huddled by the fire, rationing food and praying the cattle would survive. But they weathered it together, drawing strength from each other, and when spring finally arrived, they had lost fewer head than most of their neighbors. In late summer, Clara realized she was with child. She told James one evening after supper, watching his face carefully, unsure how he would react. His whoop of joy answered that question immediately, and he picked her up and spun her just as he had the day she agreed to marry him. Only this time he was even more careful, his hand protective on her still flat belly. "A baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Clara asked, though his reaction made the question unnecessary. "Happy does not begin to cover it," James said, kneeling down so he was eye level with her stomach. "Hello in there, little one, I am your father and I cannot wait to meet you." Clara ran her fingers through his dark hair, overcome with love for this man who had wandered into her life when she needed him most. "You are going to be a wonderful father," she whispered. The pregnancy was not easy. Clara suffered from sickness in the early months that left her weak and unable to keep much food down. James took over most of the heavy work, refusing to let her do anything that might strain her, and Clara found herself frustrated by her own limitations even as she was grateful for his care. As her belly grew, so did their excitement. James spent his evenings crafting a cradle from smooth pine, sanding it until there was not a single splinter, carving delicate designs into the headboard. Clara sewed tiny clothes from fabric she bought on their monthly trips to town, her stitches small and careful, each garment made with love. They talked late into the night about names and futures, about the kind of parents they wanted to be. James spoke of giving their child all the stability he had never known, a home that would always be there, roots that ran deep. Clara dreamed of watching their baby grow up surrounded by wide-open spaces and endless sky, learning to ride before they could barely walk, growing strong and free. When Clara's time came on a February night with snow falling softly outside, James rode through the storm to fetch the midwife from Cedar Springs, a capable woman named Mrs. Henderson, who had delivered half the babies in the territory. The labor was long and difficult, lasting well into the next day, and James paced the cabin like a caged animal, helpless in the face of Clara's pain. But when Mrs. Henderson finally emerged to tell him he had a son, a healthy boy with a strong set of lungs, James burst into the bedroom to find Clara exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in the blanket she had knitted herself. "Meet Samuel Thomas Coulter," she said softly, holding up the baby so James could see his wrinkled red face and shock of dark hair. "Samuel for your father, Thomas for mine." James stared down at his son, tears streaming unashamedly down his cheeks, and carefully took the baby into his arms. Samuel's tiny fist curled around James's calloused finger, and the cowboy felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "Hello, Samuel," he whispered. "I am your pa, and I promise I will always take care of you and your mama. I promise you will always have a home." Life took on a new rhythm after Samuel's arrival. The baby was demanding and exhausting and utterly perfect, and both James and Clara threw themselves into parenthood with the same determination they brought to ranching. They took turns walking the floor with Samuel when he cried in the night, and James proved to have an unexpected talent for soothing the baby, his deep voice and gentle rocking able to calm even the worst colicky fits. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. James hired on a couple of hands to help with the work, good men who respected the fact that Clara was an equal partner in running the operation. The Coulter Ranch gained a reputation for quality cattle and fair dealing, and their herd grew steadily. When Samuel was 3 years old, Clara became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect, and when she delivered a daughter in the autumn, it seemed to complete their family in a way that felt perfect and right. They named her Grace Elizabeth, and from the moment she was born, she had her father wrapped around her tiny finger. Samuel proved to be a protective and loving big brother, always wanting to help with the baby, bringing her his favorite toys and patting her head with chubby, gentle hands. Watching her husband with their children, seeing the tenderness and patience he showed them, Clara fell in love with James all over again in new and deeper ways. The years flowed by like water, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. There were droughts and floods, cattle thieves, and unexpected expenses, but James and Clara faced everything together, their partnership unshakable. The ranch grew into one of the most successful operations in the territory, and the little cabin was eventually replaced by a proper house with enough room for their growing family. On the 10th anniversary of the day James had first picked up a shovel and stayed, Clara woke early and slipped out of bed, leaving her husband sleeping peacefully. She walked through the house, past the rooms where Samuel and Grace slept, and out onto the porch to watch the sunrise. The well stood in the yard where it had always been, still providing reliable water for the ranch. Clara had insisted they keep it even after James suggested drilling a new one closer to the barn. It represented too much, meant too much, to be abandoned. She felt arms slip around her waist and leaned back into James's warmth, his chin resting on top of her head. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "About a woman with blistered hands digging a well alone," Clara said. "About a cowboy who picked up a shovel and stayed. About how one decision, one moment of kindness can change everything." James turned her in his arms so she was facing him, his green eyes still as clear and honest as the day she met him. "Best decision I ever made," he said. "Staying, choosing you, building this life. Best thing that ever happened to me was you riding up that day," Clara replied, reaching up to touch his face, now weathered by years of sun and wind but still achingly dear to her. "I thought I had lost everything, but instead I found everything that mattered." They stood together on the porch as the sun rose over their land. over the house they had built and the family they had created and the legacy they would leave to their children. The well continued to provide water, just as it always had, a testament to determination and partnership, and the moment when a stranger became the love of Clara's life. Inside the house, Samuel and Grace began to stir, and soon their laughter would fill the air. There would be breakfast to cook and chores to do, and 1,000 small moments that made up a life. But for now, Clara and James stood together in the dawn light, grateful for every dusty mile and hard day that had led them to each other, grateful for blistered hands and a shovel and the decision to stay. The story of the widow and the drifter became local legend over the years, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But those who knew James and Clara Coulter understood that the real story was not dramatic at all. It was simply about two people who found each other when they needed it most, who worked side by side to build something lasting, and who loved each other with a quiet, enduring devotion that never faded. Years later, when their children were grown with families of their own, when the ranch had passed to Samuel's capable hands, and James and Clara spent their days in rocking chairs on the porch, watching grandchildren play in the yard, Clara would sometimes think about that desperate time when she dug alone. She would look at her husband, his hair gone white and his hands gnarled with age but his eyes still sparkling when he looked at her, and she would marvel at the strange and wonderful path life had taken. "Do you ever regret it?" She asked him one evening, the two of them alone with the sunset and the sound of the wind through the grass. Giving up the wandering life, settling down, James took her hand, threading his fingers through hers just as he had done 1,000 times before. "Only thing I ever regretted was not finding you sooner," he said. "I wasted a lot of years drifting before I found my home, but everything I went through led me to you, so I guess I cannot regret any of it." Clara squeezed his hand, this man who had saved her ranch and stolen her heart and given her a life beyond anything she had imagined in those dark days after Thomas died. She had loved Thomas truly and well, had mourned him deeply, and she knew that love would always be a part of her. But James had taught her that the heart was capable of loving more than once, that healing did not mean forgetting, and that sometimes the greatest gifts came from the most unexpected places. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Clara leaned her head on James's shoulder and thought about legacy. They would leave behind a prosperous ranch, certainly, and children and grandchildren who would carry on their name. But more than that, they would leave behind the story of two people who had refused to give up, who had worked together to turn despair into hope, and who had built a love that would echo through generations. The well still stood in the yard, its water still cold and clear, still providing life to the land. And every time Clara looked at it, she remembered blistered hands and impossible odds and a cowboy who had picked up a shovel and changed her world forever. That was the real legacy. Not just the ranch or the children or the years of hard work, but the simple truth that love could be found in the darkest times, that kindness from strangers could bloom into forever, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was stay. James and Clara Coulter lived out their days on the ranch they had built together, surrounded by family and love and the vast Arizona sky. When they finally passed, within months of each other, as devoted couples sometimes do, they were buried side by side on a hill overlooking their land, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names and the dates of their lives. But their story lived on in the hearts of their children and their children's children, a reminder that in the wild and often harsh landscape of the frontier, the greatest adventures were not always about gunfights and gold strikes. Sometimes the greatest adventure was simply choosing to stay, to work beside someone you loved, and to build something that would endure long after you were gone. The well continued to provide water for generations, and the ranch prospered under the care of the Coulter family. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the grass and the stars blazed overhead, you could almost hear the echo of two shovels working in rhythm, digging down through hard earth toward water, toward hope, toward a future neither of them had known to dream of but both had found together. It was a love story written in blistered hands and dusty soil, in patience and perseverance and the simple choice to help someone in need. And like all the best love stories, it proved that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest gestures, with a stranger picking up a shovel and deciding to stay. Their legacy lived on in more than just land and descendants. It lived on in the values they had instilled in their children, the lessons about hard work and compassion, and standing beside the people you loved when times got hard. Samuel grew into a fine rancher and a devoted father, teaching his own children the skills James had taught him. Grace married a kind man from a neighboring ranch and became known throughout the territory for her generosity and strength. And whenever their children or grandchildren faced difficult times, whenever the challenges seemed insurmountable and the odds too steep, they would think of Clara digging alone with bleeding hands, of James choosing to stay when he could have ridden on, and they would find the courage to keep going. That was what love meant in the Wild West, in the hard country that tested everyone who tried to tame it. It meant showing up when you were needed most. It meant working side by side through drought and storm. It meant choosing each other every day, in the small moments and the large ones, until those choices wove together into a life. And so the story ended where all good love stories should end. Not with a dramatic flourish, but with a quiet sense of completion, with two lives fully lived and fully shared, with love that had started in desperation and grown into something beautiful and lasting. The cowboy had picked up a shovel and stayed, and in staying, he had found everything he had ever been looking for. And the woman with blistered hands had found that even in her darkest hour, when she thought she had lost everything, she had actually been on the verge of finding everything that truly mattered. The Arizona sun continued to rise and set over the Coulter Ranch. The seasons turned in their endless cycle, and life went on. But the memory of James and Clara's love remained, a testament to the power of choosing to stay, of choosing to love, of choosing to build something together that would outlast them both. And every time someone drew water from the old well, they were connected to that original act of partnership and determination, to the moment when everything changed because one person decided to help another, and both of their lives were transformed forever. That was their story. That was their legacy, and it was enough.